The Last Stand at Firebase Echo. Chapter 1. The Calm Before. The morning mist clung to the mountainous terrain like a shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks that surrounded Firebase Echo. Staff Sergeant Marcus Bull Rodriguez crouched behind a reinforced concrete barrier, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The silence was deceptive, too perfect, too complete for a war zone that had seen 3 months of relentless combat. "Contact been quiet for 18 hours, whispered Private First Class Danny Chen, sliding into position beside Rodriguez. His young face bore the premature lines of a soldier who had seen too much in too little time. "Think they are planning something big." Rodriguez's eyes never left the tree line below. 37 years old, 15 years of service, and he had learned to trust his instinct above all else. Something was coming. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and the familiar weight in his stomach, the one that always preceded hell breaking loose, had been growing heavier by the hour. "They're out there, Chen. Watching. Waiting." His voice carried the gravelly tone of a man who had screamed orders over artillery fire more times than he cared to count. "Question isn't if they're coming. It's when." Firebase Echo sat perched on a strategic ridge overlooking the Khyber Valley, a critical supply route that both sides desperately needed to control. The base housed 43 American soldiers, 2 Apache helicopters when they weren't out on patrol, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army, which Rodriguez suspected they were about to need. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell emerged from the command bunker, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, much streaking her combat fatigues. At 25, she was young for her rank, but Rodriguez had watched her earn every stripe through blood, sweat, and steel. She moved with a purposeful stride of someone who had learned to make life-and-death decisions in split seconds. "Intel just came through," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning air. "Satellite imagery shows movement. Lots of it. 3 clicks north, 2 clicks east, and what looks like a full regiment moving up the southern approach." Rodriguez set down his coffee cup, the ceramic clinking against the concrete. "How long do we have?" 12 hours. Maybe less if they push hard." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Command says reinforcements are 48 hours out. Weather's grounding air support until this front moves through." The weight in Rodriguez's stomach doubled. 43 soldiers against a regiment. Those weren't odds. That was a mathematical certainty of death. He had been in impossible situations before, but this one felt different. This one felt final. Corporal James Hawkeye Davidson looked up from where he was cleaning his M24 sniper rifle. 6 feet 2 inches of Kentucky mountain man, Davidson could put a bullet through a playing card at 800 meters in a crosswind. His calm blue eyes held no fear, only the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. "Well, I reckon we're about to earn our pay," Davidson drawled, his southern accent thick as molasses. "Been getting bored anyway." The humor was dark, gallows comedy that had kept soldiers sane since warfare began. But Rodriguez could see the tension in the way Davidson's fingers moved over his rifle, the meticulous care he took with each component. They all knew what was coming. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos jogged up the slope from the motor pool, her boots splashing through puddles left by the overnight rain. Santos was the backbone of Echo Company, 5'4" of pure determination wrapped in army green. She had earned her stripes the hard way, fighting prejudice and proving herself in a man's world through sheer competence and unwavering courage. "Vehicles are prepped and ready," she reported, slightly out of breath. "Ammunition distributed. Defensive positions reinforced. The boys are scared, but they're ready." Rodriguez nodded. Santos always told it straight, no sugarcoating. If she said they were ready, they were as ready as they could be. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. "Good. Make sure everyone understands. We hold this position at all costs. That supply route stays open, or a lot of good people are going to die waiting for supplies that will never come." Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of command, the burden of sending young men and women into harm's way. "This is what we trained for." But training and reality were 2 different things. Training didn't account for the way your hands shook when the first mortar round whistled overhead. Training didn't prepare you for the smell of cordite and blood, or the way time seemed to slow down when bullets started flying. Training was sterile, controlled, safe. War was chaos wrapped in violence, seasoned with terror and served at the temperature of fresh hell. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the harsh beauty of the Afghan mountains. From their elevated position, Firebase Echo commanded an impressive view of the surrounding terrain. To the north, rocky outcropping provided natural cover for approaching forces. To the east, a dried riverbed cut a winding path through the valley floor. To the south, the main road snaked between hills like a concrete river, the lifeline they had been sent to protect. And to the west, the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in clouds that promised more rain before nightfall. Somewhere in those mountains, an enemy force was moving with deadly purpose, closing the distance between life and death one step at a time. Rodriguez walked the perimeter, checking positions, talking to his soldiers. Each face told a story: fear, determination, resignation, defiance. Private Jackson, 19 years old from Detroit, cleaning his M4 with shaking hands. Specialist Morrison, tough as nail from the streets of Chicago, joking with her squad mates to keep their spirits up. Corporal Williams, a medic who had saved more lives than he could count, preparing his aid station with grim efficiency. They were good soldiers, every one of them. They had trained together, fought together, bled together. Some had been with Rodriguez for over a year. Others were fresh replacements who still jumped at unexpected sounds. But they were his responsibility, his people, his family in the way that only combat could forge. The radio crackled to life in the command bunker. Echo Base, this is Overwatch. Confirming enemy movement. Large force, estimated battalion strength minimum. Moving on your position. ETA 6 hours and closing. 6 hours. Rodriguez felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the adrenaline beginning to flow through his system. 6 hours to live or die, to stand or fall, to write the final chapter of Firebase Echo's story in blood and brass. He keyed the radio. Overwatch, Echo Base. Copy that. Request immediate air support. Danger close authorization. Negative, Echo Base. Weather's got everything grounded. You're on your own until this storm passes. On their own. The story of his military career, Rodriguez thought grimly. Always outnumbered, always outgunned, always expected to work miracles with determination and ammunition. Well, they had plenty of both. Lieutenant Mitchell appeared at his shoulder, her face set in determined lines. Orders, Sergeant. Rodriguez looked out at the mountains, at the deceptive beauty of the landscape that would soon run red with blood. He thought of his wife back home, of the letter in his footlocker that he had written but never sent, the one that tried to explain why he did what he did, why he stayed when he could have gotten out years ago. We dig in deep and we hold the line, he said finally. No matter what comes over those hills, we make them pay for every inch. This is our ground now, and we don't give it back. The next 6 hours passed like a fever dream. Equipment checks, ammunition counts, final preparations. The soldiers of Firebase Echo moved with the efficient urgency of people who knew their time was running out. Personal items were secured, letters were written, prayers were whispered to whatever gods soldiers prayed to when death came knocking. Rodriguez found himself thinking about the path that had led him here, to this moment, to this choice between duty and survival. He had joined the army at 18, full of patriotic fire and teenage invincibility. That young man seemed like a stranger now, someone he had known in another lifetime before war had stripped away illusions and left only the hardcore purpose. 15 years of service had taken him from the green fields of basic training to the urban warfare of Iraq, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the frozen hell of northern Syria. He had seen friends die, had killed enemies who were probably someone else's friends, had carried out orders that kept him awake at night and others that he was proud to have executed. But this felt different. This felt like an ending. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western peaks. Shadows lengthened, temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the indefinable smell of approaching violence. Sergeant, Chen called from his position at the eastern lookout. Movement in the riverbed. Looks like advanced scouts. Rodriguez grabbed his binoculars and focused on the dried watercourse. There, a flash of movement between the rocks, the brief gleam of sunlight on metal. Professional soldiers, moving with purpose and skill. This wasn't going to be a ragtag militia assault. These were trained fighters who knew their business. How many? He asked. Hard to tell. At least a squad, maybe more. They are staying low, using the terrain. Rodriguez lowered the binoculars. Scout teams meant the main force wasn't far behind. Time was up. All positions. This is Rodriguez. Enemy scout confirmed in Sector 7. Lock and load. People. This is it. The metallic sound of weapons being chambered echoed across Firebase Echo as 43 soldiers prepared to face an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the defensive positions, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Whether from the approaching storm or the sound of heavy equipment, Rodriguez couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. The die was cast, the pieces were in motion, and all that remained was to see who would be left standing when the smoke cleared. Chapter 2. First Contact. The attack came at sunset, as Rodriguez had known it would. The dying light would give the attackers cover while silhouetting the defenders against the sky. It was a textbook assault, professionally planned and brutally executed. The first mortar rounds whistled overhead at 1847 hours, impacting behind the main defensive line in carefully calculated patterns designed to disrupt communications and pin down the defenders. Rodriguez hit the deck as dirt and shrapnel rained down around him, the familiar weight of his rifle a comfort in his hands. "Incoming!" he shouted, though everyone had already taken cover. The mortar barrage continued for 3 minutes, an eternity when every second brought the possibility of sudden, violent death. The enemy gunners were good, walking their fire across Firebase Echo with mathematical precision. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the barrage stopped. In the sudden silence, Rodriguez could hear the ringing in his ears and the labored breathing of his soldiers. Smoke and dust drifted across the firebase, creating a hellish twilight landscape of shadows and debris. "Sound off," he barked. "Who's it?" Reports came back from around the perimeter. Miraculously, the mortar attack had caused only minor casualties, a few cuts from flying debris, one soldier with a possible concussion from a near miss. Either they had gotten lucky, or this was just the opening movement of a longer symphony of violence. "Contact front." Davidson's voice carried clear and cold over the battlefield. Multiple targets, 800 meters, moving through the rocks. Rodriguez low-crawled to the forward observation post where the sniper had set up his hide. Through his scope, Davidson was tracking target with the patience of a born hunter. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. "How many?" Rodriguez asked. 30, maybe 40 in the first wave. Professional soldiers, good equipment, moving in coordinated teams. Davidson's voice never wavered, calm as discussing the weather. "There will be more behind them." Rodriguez keyed his radio. "All positions. Enemy assault teams advancing on the perimeter. Hold fire until they reach the wire. Make every shot count." The wire was their first line of defense, coils of razor wire and improvised obstacles that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Behind that, fighting positions had been carved into the rocky soil and reinforced with sandbags and steel plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles. The attacking force moved with disciplined efficiency, advancing in bounds while covering team provided suppressive fire. These weren't the wild-eyed fanatics that propaganda portrayed. They were soldiers, trained and equipped and professional. That made them infinitely more dangerous. "Sergeant." Chen called from the eastern position. "More movement. Looks like they are trying to flank us." Rodriguez cursed under his breath. A frontal assault combined with flanking maneuvers meant they were facing a coordinated attack by experienced commanders. The enemy had done their homework, studied Firebase Echo's defenses, and planned accordingly. "Santos, take 3rd Squad and reinforce the eastern approaches. Don't let them get behind us." "Roger that." Santos was already moving, her squad following her in a tactical formation that spoke of countless hours of training. They disappeared into the maze of defensive positions as the first enemy soldiers reached the wire. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm. Muzzle flashes lit up the growing darkness as Firebase Echo's defenders opened fire on the advancing assault teams. The sharp crack of M4 carbines mixed with the deeper boom of the squad automatic weapons, creating a symphony of controlled violence. Davidson's rifle spoke with deadly precision, the suppressed crack barely audible over the general chaos. 800 meters away, an enemy squad leader pitched forward and didn't get up. 700 meters, Another target down. 600. A machine gunner fell backward, his weapon spinning away into the rocks. Beautiful shooting. Hawkeye. Rodriguez called out. Just getting warmed up, Davidson replied, already acquiring his next target. But for every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The attacking force had committed to the assault with overwhelming numbers, accepting casualties as a price of victory. Mortar rounds began falling again, this time closer to the defensive positions. Rodriguez felt the familiar calm that came over him in combat, the slowing of time and sharpening of senses that had kept him alive through 15 years of war. Every detail became crystal clear. The smell of cordite, the feel of his rifle stock against his shoulder, the sound of bullets cracking overhead. RPG! Someone screamed. Rodriguez threw himself sideways as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the sandbags 5 feet from his position. The explosion sent him tumbling, ears ringing, vision blurred by dust and debris. He rolled to his belly and came up firing, his rifle spitting bullets at the muzzle flashes in the darkness below. A second RPG impacted the communications bunker, and Rodriguez saw Lieutenant Mitchell thrown clear by the blast. She landed hard but rolled to her feet, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, her rifle still in her hands. "Mitchell, you okay?" he called. "Still breathing," she shouted back, taking cover behind a damaged concrete barrier. "Radio's down. We're cut off." Cut off from command, surrounded by superior numbers, under attack by professional soldiers who had planned his assault down to the last detail. Rodriguez had been in worse situations, or at least he told himself he had. The important thing now was to keep his people alive long enough for something to change, for some opportunity to present itself. "Chen, how's your sector?" They are trying to get through the wire. I count at least 20, maybe more. The wire was holding, but not for long. Enemy engineers were already working to breach the obstacles, using Bangalore torpedoes and wire cutters to clear paths for the assault troops. Once they broke through the outer perimeter, the fighting would become close and personal. Santos's voice crackled over the radio from the eastern position. "Sergeant, they've got us flanked. Heavy machine gun, maybe 200 meters south of our position. We need support." Rodriguez looked around the firebase. Every position was engaged, every soldier fighting for his life against overwhelming odds. There was no reserve to send, no cavalry riding to the rescue. They were on their own, 43 soldiers against what looked like an entire battalion. Negative on the support. Santos, hold your ground. Make them pay for it. He could hear the intensity of the fighting from the eastern side increasing, the higher rate of fire, the sharp crack of grenades, the shouted orders and screams of wounded men. Santos and her squad were buying time with blood, trading their lives for precious minutes that might make the difference between survival and annihilation. Davidson's rifle cracked again, and another enemy soldier fell. But Rodriguez could see that even the sniper was beginning to feel the pressure. Targets were everywhere, more than one man could possibly engage. For every enemy he dropped, 5 more advanced through the rocks below. "Hawkeye, we need to start thinking about falling back to the secondary positions," Rodriguez called. "Give me 2 more minutes," Davidson replied, his voice tight with concentration. "I can see their command team. If I can take out their leadership." A burst of automatic fire stitched across the sniper's position, forcing him to duck below the sandbags. When he came back up, the opportunity was gone. The enemy commanders had identified his position and were now targeting it specifically. "Time's up," Rodriguez shouted. "All positions, prepare to fall back to the secondary line. Fighting withdrawal, by the numbers." The secondary defensive line was 100 meters closer to the Firebase's center, anchored on the command bunker and the motor pool. It was a tighter perimeter, easy to defend but also easier to surround. Once they fell back to that line, there would be nowhere else to go. The withdrawal began under covering fire from the squad automatic weapons. Chen and his team moved first, bounding back while Davidson and the other marksmen kept enemy heads down. The movement was textbook perfect. Advance, fire, move, fire. But Rodriguez could see that his soldiers were beginning to show the strain of prolonged combat. Private Jackson stumbled as he ran, exhaustion and adrenaline taking their toll. Specialist Morrison grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet, half carrying him to the next position. Corporal Williams, the medic, was treating a soldier with a shrapnel wound while bullets cracked overhead, his hand steady despite the chaos around him. These were good soldiers, Rodriguez thought with fierce pride. Green or experienced, they were all fighting like veterans now, their training taking over when conscious thought became impossible. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would sell their lives dearly. The enemy assault teams reached the wire just as the last defender cleared the primary positions. Rodriguez watched through his scope as engineers worked frantically to clear the obstacles while riflemen provided covering fire. Professional soldiers, disciplined and determined. In other circumstances, he might have admired their tactical competence. Claymores armed and ready, Chen reported from the secondary line. The anti-personnel mines had been positioned to cover the approaches to the Firebase's inner perimeter. When the enemy assault teams cleared the wire, they would walk into a killing field. "Wait for my command," Rodriguez ordered. Timing would be everything. Too early, and the mines would waste their effectiveness on empty ground. Too late, and the assault teams would be close enough to overwhelm the remaining defenders through sheer numbers. The first enemy soldiers cleared the wire and began advancing up the slope toward the Firebase. Rodriguez counted them through his scope: 10, 15, 20 soldiers in the lead element, with more behind them. Professional spacing, good fire discipline, textbook assault formation. 25 soldiers now, moving at a tactical pace, weapons at the ready. They had learned caution from the casualties they had taken, but they were still coming. Nothing was going to stop them short of decisive action. 30 soldiers. Close enough. Claymores. Rodriguez shouted. "Fire in the hole." Chen triggered the anti-personnel mines in sequence, turning the slope below the Firebase into a hell of flying steel and explosive force. The leading edge of the assault dissolved in blood and smoke, cut down by the carefully positioned mines. The survivors went to ground, seeking cover among the rocks and debris. But there were always more. Rodriguez could see them in the darkness, moving like shadows, professional soldiers who accepted casualties as the price of victory. They would regroup, find new approaches, and continue the assault. It was just a matter of time. "Sergeant." Santos's voice was strained over the radio. "We can't hold much longer. They are bringing up heavy weapons." Rodriguez looked toward the eastern perimeter where Santos and her squad were fighting their own desperate battle. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies, and he could hear the distinctive sound of belt-fed machine guns joining the firefight. Time was running out. The enemy had them surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. Air support was grounded by weather. Reinforcements were 48 hours away, and the radio was dead. By any reasonable military calculation, Firebase Echo should have been overrun already. But reasonable calculations didn't account for the human factor, the stubborn refusal of soldiers to quit even when the odds were impossible. Rodriguez had seen it before, in Iraq and Afghanistan and a dozen other places where good soldiers had stood their ground against overwhelming odds. Sometimes they had lost. Sometimes they had won. Sometimes they had simply held on long enough for something to change, for help to arrive or the enemy to make a critical mistake. Tonight, holding on would have to be enough. Chapter 3. The Long Night. The enemy's second assault came at midnight, heralded by another mortar barrage that walked across Firebase Echo with methodical precision. This time, the enemy gunners had found their range, and the impacts were closer, more accurate, more deadly. Rodriguez pressed himself against the bottom of his fighting position as Dotan's shrapnel rained down around him. A near miss threw him against the sandbags, his helmet ringing like a bell from a piece of flying metal. Blood trickled down his face from a scalp wound, but he ignored it. He had been hurt worth shaving. The barrage lifted, and immediately the night erupted with gunfire as enemy assault teams advanced under cover of the smoke and confusion. But this time, they came from 3 directions simultaneously, north, east, and south, while heavy machine guns on the western ridge provided covering fire. Contact on all sides. Lieutenant Mitchell's voice carried over the chaos. She had established a command post in the ruins of the communications bunker, directing the defense with calm professionalism despite the blood still seeping from the cut on her forehead. Rodriguez keyed his radio. "All positions. This is the main event. Make it count." The enemy had learned from their first assault. Instead of advancing in neat formations, they came in small teams that used fire and movement to close the distance. Professional soldiers, Rodriguez noted grimly, led by commanders who understood modern infantry tactics. Davidson's sniper rifle cracked steadily from his new position near the motor pool. The big Kentuckian had fallen back with the rest of them, but had found a new hide with good fields of fire across the approaches to Firebase. Enemy soldiers fell with mechanical regularity, but there were always more. "I'm running low on ammo," Davidson reported, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Maybe 20 rounds left." 20 rounds. Rodriguez felt the weight of mathematics pressing down on him. Ammunition was finite. Time was running out, and the enemy seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of soldiers willing to die for their cause. On the eastern perimeter, Santos and her squad were fighting a desperate battle against superior numbers. The distinctive chatter of AK-47s mixed with the sharper crack of M4 carbines as American and enemy soldiers traded fire at close range. "Santos, report." Rodriguez called. "Still here, Sergeant," she replied, breathing hard. "Lost Williams and Jackson. Morrison's hit, but still fighting. We're down to our last magazines." Williams and Jackson. Rodriguez felt a familiar ache of command, the weight of responsibility for every life lost under his command. Good soldiers, both of them. Williams had saved more lives than he could count, and Jackson had been writing letters to a girlfriend back home who would now never see him again. But grief was a luxury commanders couldn't afford in the middle of a firefight. Rodriguez pushed the pain aside and focused on the tactical situation. His soldiers were running low on ammunition, casualties were mounting, and the enemy showed no sign of slackening their assault. "Chen, how's your sector?" "They are in the wire again. I count at least 15, maybe more. They got some kind of heavy weapon. Looks like a recoilless rifle." A recoilless rifle. Rodriguez cursed it under his breath. The enemy was bringing up heavier weapons, escalating the firepower equation in their favor. A recoilless rifle could punch through the Firebase's improvised fortifications like they were made of paper. The weapon spoke with a deep, authoritative boom that cut through the chaos of small arms fire. The round impacted the eastern bunker where Santos and her squad were fighting, collapsing one wall and filling the position with smoke and debris. "Santos, report." Silence on the radio. Rodriguez felt his heart skip a beat as seconds ticked by without response. Then, finally, Santos's voice came through, weak but determined. "Still here, Sergeant. Lost Morrison. Down to 3 effectives, maybe 4 if you count the walking wounded." 3 effectives. Rodriguez did quick mental math. Santos, probably Chen, and maybe one other soldier holding the entire eastern approach against squad-sized enemy elements. The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving, and they were rapidly approaching the point where mathematics would overcome courage. The recoilless rifle fired again, this time targeting the motor pool where Davidson had his hide. The explosion lit up the night, sending burning fuel and twisted metal spinning through the air. For a moment, Rodriguez feared the worst, but then Davidson's rifle cracked again. The sniper was still in the fight. "Hawkeye, you okay?" "Define okay," Davidson replied dryly. "Lost my primary hide, and something's on fire that probably shouldn't be. But I can still shoot." Rodriguez looked around the Firebase at what remained of his command. 43 soldiers had started the day. Now he could see perhaps 20 still fighting, scattered among the defensive positions, their ammunition running low and their faces grim with the knowledge that dawn was still hours away. But they were still fighting. Despite impossible odds, despite being cut off and surrounded, despite facing professional soldiers with superior numbers and heavy weapons, the men and women of Firebase Echo were still in the fight. Rodriguez felt a fierce pride that almost overcame the tactical despair of their situation. The enemy assault teams had reached the inner perimeter now, and the fighting became close and personal. Hand grenades exploded among the defensive positions, filling the air with deadly fragments. Rodriguez saw Chen roll clear of his fighting position just as an enemy grenade landed inside it, the explosion sending sandbags flying. "Chen!" The young soldier came up firing, his rifle spitting bullets at point-blank range into an enemy assault team that had gotten too close. 2 enemy soldiers fell, but Chen took a bullet in the shoulder that spun him around and dropped him to one knee. Rodriguez was moving before conscious thought took over, sprinting across the Firebase through the chaos of combat. Bullets cracked around him, one tugging at his sleeve, another sparking off his helmet. He reached Chen just as a young soldier was trying to reload with one working arm. "I got you, son," Rodriguez said, dropping beside him and adding his fire to Chen's. The combined firepower drove back the enemy assault team, buying them precious seconds of breathing room. Rodriguez looked at Chen's wound, a through and through in the shoulder, bleeding but not immediately life-threatening. The young soldier's face was pale with shock and blood loss, but his eyes were still clear and determined. "Can you fight?" Rodriguez asked. "Yes, Sergeant," Chen replied without hesitation. "Good man." Rodriguez helped him into a more defensible position and checked his ammunition status. Chen had maybe one magazine left, plus whatever he could scavenge from the positions of soldiers who were no longer in need of ammunition. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy soldiers had penetrated the outer defenses at multiple points, and the defenders were being compressed into an ever smaller perimeter. It was only a matter of time before superior numbers and firepower overwhelmed the remaining resistance. But Rodriguez had been in impossible situations before. The key to survival wasn't avoiding the impossible. It was making the impossible work for you instead of against you. Sometimes that meant heroic charges. Sometimes it meant tactical withdrawals, and sometimes it meant holding on by your fingernails until something changed. Tonight, it meant turning Firebase Echo into a fortress that would cost the enemy more than they were willing to pay. "All positions, this is Rodriguez," he called over the radio. "We're going to make them come to us. Concentrate your fire on the approaches to the command bunker. Make every shot count, and don't waste ammunition on targets you can't hit." The Firebase's remaining defenders pulled back to their final positions around the command bunker and motor pool. It was a tight perimeter, maybe 50 meters across, anchored on the most solid structures remaining after hours of mortar fire and close combat. Lieutenant Mitchell appeared beside Rodriguez, her uniform torn and bloodstained but her rifle ready. "Ammunition status?" she asked. "Critical. Maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire, 15 if we're careful." Rodriguez reloaded his rifle, counting rounds by feel in the darkness. "How many effectives do we have left?" 18, maybe 20 if you count the walking wounded. Mitchell's voice was steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "Santos has 3 on the eastern side, Davidson still shooting from the motor pool, and the rest are here." 18 soldiers against what intelligence had estimated as a full regiment. The mathematics were clear. Barring divine intervention or catastrophic enemy mistakes, Firebase Echo would fall before dawn. The only question was how many enemy soldiers they could take with them. But Rodriguez had learned long ago that military mathematics rarely accounted for human factors like courage, determination, and the stubborn refusal to quit when quitting made perfect sense. Good soldiers could hold impossible positions, could achieve impossible objectives, could survive impossible odds through sheer blood-minded determination. Whether they were good enough remained to be seen. The enemy regrouped for what Rodriguez sensed would be their final assault. He could hear commanders shouting orders in the darkness, could see the muzzle flashes of covering fire as assault teams moved into position. Professional soldiers, but they had paid a heavy price for their professionalism. The slope below Firebase Echo was littered with their dead and wounded. "Here they come again," Davidson reported from the motor pool. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders and breathing cordite smoke, but it held the same calm competence that carried him through 15 years of combat. Rodriguez looked around at his remaining soldiers. Young faces marked by combat, experienced faces marked by too much combat, all of them united by the bond that only shared danger could create. They were good soldiers, every one of them. Whatever happened in the next hour, they would not shame the uniform they wore or the flag they served. The final assault began with a sustained barrage from the recoilless rifle, systematically dismantling Firebase Echo's remaining fortifications. Each round was precisely aimed, turning fighting positions into smoking craters and solid cover into twisted wreckage. Then came the mortars, walking across the Firebase in coordinated patterns designed to suppress defensive fire and disrupt command and control. Rodriguez hugged the bottom of his fighting position as the world exploded around him, debris raining from the sky like deadly hail. When the barrage lifted, enemy assault teams were already within grenade range, having use of covering fire to close the distance under cover of smoke and darkness. Professional soldiers, moving with the disciplined efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Rodriguez came up firing, his rifle on full automatic for the first time all night. At this range, accuracy mattered less than volume of fire, suppressing the enemy long enough for his soldiers to get their heads up and weapons into action. The final battle for Firebase Echo was fought at handshake range, American and enemy soldiers trading fire across distances measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. Hand grenades exploded with deadly regularity, filling the air with flying fragments and the screams of wounded men. Rodriguez saw Chen go down, clutching his chest, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. Specialist Morrison fought on with a bayonet after her rifle jammed, her face a mask of determination and fury. Corporal Davis, the quiet kid from Minnesota, stood in the ruins of his fighting position and emptied magazine after magazine into the advancing enemy until a burst of automatic fire cut him down. Good soldiers, all of them. Heroes who would never be recognized, warriors who fought not for glory or recognition, but because their brothers and sisters needed them to fight. Rodriguez felt the familiar pride that came from commanding such people, even as tactical reality forced him to accept that pride would not be enough to save them. The enemy was everywhere now, infiltrating the Firebase's final perimeter from multiple directions. Rodriguez could see enemy soldiers moving through the ruins of positions his people had died defending, advancing with the inexorable patience of professionals who knew victory was within their grasp. But Firebase Echo was not finished yet. As long as one American soldier remained alive and capable of fighting, the Firebase would continue to resist. That was a code Rodriguez had lived by for 15 years, and it was a code he would die by if necessary. The night was far from over. Chapter 4, Dawn's Early Light. At 0347 hours, something changed. Rodriguez was reloading his rifle for what felt like the 100th time when he heard it, the distant thrum of rotor blades cutting through the storm. He looked up from his fighting position, straining to see through the smoke and darkness that shrouded Firebase Echo. "Did you hear that?" Lieutenant Mitchell called from her position 20 meters away. Rodriguez listened intently. There it was again, helicopter rotors, getting closer. But the weather had grounded all aircraft. What had changed? The sound grew louder, more distinct. Not one helicopter, but several. Rodriguez felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in hours. Hope? Maybe command had found a way through the storm. Maybe the cavalry was finally riding to the rescue. But hope was a dangerous emotion in combat. It could make you careless, make you take risks that got people killed. Rodriguez pushed the feeling aside and focused on the tactical reality of his situation. Even if help was coming, Firebase Echo still had to survive the next few minutes. The enemy had heard the helicopters too. Rodriguez could see confusion in their assault formations as commanders tried to decide whether to press their attack or prepare for aerial assault. Professional soldiers or not, the sudden appearance of American air power would change their tactical calculations dramatically. A flare burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in harsh white light that turned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and wreckage. In that pitiless illumination, Rodriguez could see the true scope of the carnage. Bodies littered the approaches to Firebase Echo, American and enemy alike, testament to hours of savage fighting. But he could also see that his people were still fighting. Santos emerged from the ruins of the eastern bunker, blood streaming down her face, but her rifle still functional. Davidson's sniper rifle cracked from a new position near the communications equipment, each shot precisely aimed despite the chaos around him. The helicopter rotors grew louder, and Rodriguez could make out individual aircraft now, 2 Apache gunships and what looked like a Black Hawk transport. The Apaches peeled off and began their attack runs, their 30mm chain guns chattering death into the enemy positions below. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy soldiers who had been advancing with professional confidence suddenly found themselves under attack from above, caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The Apaches worked methodically, their thermal imaging systems picking out targets in the darkness and eliminating them with surgical precision. "Air support is here." Rodriguez shouted into his radio. "Mark your positions. Friendly forces, mark your positions." The remaining defenders of Firebase Echo popped smoke grenades and strobes, identifying the locations to the helicopter crews. The Apache pilots acknowledged with a waggle of their rotors before resuming their deadly work. But the enemy wasn't finished. Professional soldiers adapt to changing circumstances, and Rodriguez could see their commanders already reorganizing their forces to deal with the aerial threat. Heavy machine guns and shoulder-fired missiles appeared from concealed positions, reaching up toward the helicopters with deadly intent. One of the Apaches shuddered as a missile exploded nearby, but the pilot maintained control and continued his attack run. These were experienced crews, veterans who knew their business and understood the risks. They had come through the storm to help, and they weren't going to waste the opportunity. The Black Hawk settled into a defensive orbit above the Firebase, its door gunners adding their fire to the Apaches as a rope dropped from the aircraft. Rodriguez watched in amazement as soldiers fast-roped down into the Firebase, reinforcements. Finally, when he had given up hope of seeing any, the first soldier to hit the ground was a Master Sergeant Rodriguez didn't recognize, but the man moved with the confident efficiency of a special operations veteran. His equipment was different from standard infantry issue, more sophisticated, more deadly, designed for missions that didn't officially exist. Sergeant Rodriguez, the newcomer, called out, "Hey!" Rodriguez replied, rising from his fighting position. "Master Sergeant Blake, Special Operations. We're here to get you out." Blake's voice was calm and professional, as if extracting surrounded forces from impossible situations was routine business. "What's your status?" 18 effectives, maybe 20 counting walking wounded. Low on ammunition, multiple casualties. Rodriguez gestured toward the ruins of Firebase Echo. "We've been holding since sunset, but we can't hold much longer." Blake nodded, already assessing the tactical situation with practiced eyes. "The Apaches can give us maybe 10 minutes of close support before they have to break off and refuel. That's our window." 10 minutes. Rodriguez looked around at the Firebase's shattered defenses, at his exhausted soldiers, at the enemy forces that were already adapting to the new threat. 10 minutes to extract 20 soldiers from a Firebase surrounded by hostile forces who had spent hours trying to overrun it. "What do you need from us?" Rodriguez asked. "Cover the landing zone, and be ready to move fast when I give the word." Blake keyed his radio. "Black Hawk 2-7. This is ground team. Landing zone is hot but manageable. Request immediate extraction. Over." The Black Hawk pilot's voice crackled back. "Copy, ground team. Beginning approach now. Make it fast. We're taking fire from multiple positions." Indeed, enemy soldiers were shooting at the helicopter from concealed positions throughout the surrounding terrain. Tracer rounds reached up like deadly fireworks, and Rodriguez could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft. But the pilot was good, probably a veteran of countless similar missions. The Black Hawk came in fast and low, flaring at the last second to settle onto the Firebase's improvised landing zone. The rotor wash sent debris flying everywhere, and the sound of the engines drowned out everything else. "Go! Go! Go!" Blake shouted. The wounded went first, carried by their comrades, and loaded onto the helicopter with efficient urgency. Rodriguez watched as Chen, barely conscious from blood loss, was helped aboard by 2 of Blake's men. Santos followed, supporting another wounded soldier, her face grim with pain and exhaustion. The Apaches continued their deadly wake, keeping enemy heads down while the extraction proceeded. But Rodriguez could see enemy soldiers moving to better positions, setting up a coordinated fire on the helicopter. Time was running out. "Rodriguez, you're next." Blake called. Rodriguez shook his head. "My people first. I'm not leaving anyone behind." It was a code he had lived by for 15 years. Officers last, soldiers first, no one left behind. Blake understood without explanation, nodding his approval before turning to oversee the continuing extraction. Davidson emerged from the motor pool, supporting a wounded soldier with one arm while carrying his sniper rifle with the other. The big Kentuckian's face was streaked with blood and cordite smoke, but his eyes held the same calm competence they had shown all night. "Hell of a fight, Sergeant," Davidson said as he helped load the wounded soldier onto the Black Hawk. "Hell of a fight," Rodriguez agreed. Lieutenant Mitchell was among the last aboard, her command responsibilities, keeping her on the ground until her soldiers were safe. She paused beside Rodriguez before climbing onto the helicopter. "Good work tonight, Sergeant. Your people fought like heroes." "They are heroes," Rodriguez replied. "Every damned one of them." Blake appeared at Rodriguez's shoulder. "Time to go, Sergeant. Everyone's accounted for." Rodriguez took one last look around Firebase Echo. 12 hours ago, It had been a functioning military installation, home to 43 American soldiers. Now it was a smoking ruin, its walls shattered by mortar fire, its buildings collapsed by recoilless rifle rounds, its grounds littered with the debris of battle. But it had held. Against impossible odds, outnumbered and outgunned, cut off from support and surrounded by professional soldiers, Firebase Echo had held. The supply route remained open, the strategic position remained in American hands, and most importantly, his people were going home. Rodriguez climbed aboard the Black Hawk as Blake's team provided covering fire. The helicopter lifted off immediately, rising into the storm-torn sky while the Apaches covered their withdrawal. Below, Firebase Echo fell away into darkness, its story written in blood and brass and the stubborn courage of American soldiers. The extraction was not without cost. Enemy fire followed them up, bullets sparking off the helicopter's armored hull, and one of the Apaches reported damage from a shoulder-fired missile. But military aviation crews were good at their jobs, experienced in the deadly business of getting people out of impossible situations. As they climbed towards safety, Rodriguez looked around the helicopter's cargo bay at his surviving soldiers. Wounded, exhausted, marked by combat, but alive. They had held an impossible position against impossible odds and lived to tell about it. Not all of them. Too many good soldiers had fallen during the long night, but enough to carry on the unit's traditions and honor. Chen was unconscious, hooked to an foreline, but the medic said he would make it. Santos sat with her eyes closed, finally allowing exhaustion to show now that the immediate danger was past. Davidson cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision, his hands steady despite everything they had been through. Good soldiers, all of them. Heroes who would probably never be recognized as such. Warriors who had done their duty when duty demanded everything they had to give. Rodriguez felt the familiar pride of command, tempered by grief for those who wouldn't be making the trip home. The helicopter climbed through the storm, buffeted by winds and rain, but climbing steadily toward the larger base where medical care and hot food and clean bunks waited. Behind them, Firebase Echo burned in the darkness, its strategic value purchased with blood and courage and the kind of stubborn determination that had characterized American soldiers since Valley Forge. Epilogue, after action. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez sat in a field hospital in Germany, his left arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds he didn't even remember receiving. The doctor said he would heal completely, that the scars would fade with time, that he could return to duty in 6 weeks if he wanted to. If he wanted to. 15 years of service, and for the first time, Rodriguez wasn't sure what he wanted. The letter from his wife sat on the bedside table, opened and refolded so many times the creases were wearing through. She had seen the news reports, had waited by the phone for notification that never came, had finally learned he was alive through a Red Cross message 3 days after the battle. "I'm proud of you," the letter said. "I've always been proud of you, but I need you to come home. We need you to come home." Home. Rodriguez looked out the hospital window at the German countryside, peaceful and green and unmarked by war. Somewhere in those rolling hills, American soldiers were training for their own deployments, preparing to face their own impossible situations in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. Chen had been released from the hospital the week before, his wounds healed enough for light duty. The young soldier had stopped by Rodriguez's room before shipping out, still pale but determined to return to his unit. Santos had been promoted to staff sergeant and given command of a new squad. Davidson had taken 2 weeks of leave to go hunting in Kentucky, claiming he needed to shoot something that wasn't shooting back. Good soldiers, all of them. The Army would rebuild Firebase Echo, would staff it with new soldiers, would continue the mission that had cost so much to maintain. The supply route remained open. The strategic objectives had been achieved, and the official reports would record the action as a successful defense against superior enemy forces. But Rodriguez knew the real story wasn't in the official reports. The real story was in the faces of young soldiers who had discovered they were capable of more than they had ever imagined, in the bonds forged under fire that would last a lifetime, in the knowledge that when everything else failed, they had not failed each other. That was the story that mattered. That was a story that would outlast the official reports and the medal citations and the strategic analyses. It was a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had to, because their brothers and sisters were counting on them, because that's what soldiers do. Rodriguez picked up a pen and began writing his own letter, not to command or to the official record keepers, but to the families of the soldiers who wouldn't be coming home. It was the hardest duty he had ever performed, harder than holding Firebase Echo against impossible odds, but it was a duty that came with command. Each letter was different, personal, honest about what their sons and daughters had accomplished in the darkness of that long night. They had died as soldiers, fighting for their brothers and sisters, holding an impossible position because someone had to hold it. They had not died in vain. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over the German countryside. Somewhere, other soldiers were standing watch, holding other impossible positions, writing their own chapters in the long story of American military service. The war would continue, as wars always did, but Firebase Echo's part in it was over. Rodriguez finished the last letter and sealed the envelope. Tomorrow, he would call his wife and tell her he was coming home. After 15 years, it was time. But he would always remember the night when 43 American soldiers held an impossible position against impossible odds, when ordinary people achieved extraordinary things, when Firebase Echo proved that some lines cannot be crossed as long as good soldiers are willing to hold them. The battle was over. The war continued. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, a new group of soldiers was learning the lessons that Rodriguez and his people had written in blood and brass and unbreakable determination. That was enough. It had to be enough. As the sun set over Germany, Rodriguez closed his eyes and allowed himself to sleep without the sound of gunfire for the first time in 3 weeks. In his dreams, he was back at Firebase Echo, standing with his soldiers in the moment before the battle began, when they were all still alive and the night held only possibilities. It was a good dream. It was enough. Author's note: this story is dedicated to all the soldiers who have held impossible positions, who have stood their ground when retreat made perfect sense, who have proven that courage is not the absence of fear but a decision that something else is more important than fear. Firebase Echo exists wherever soldiers stand watch in the darkness, holding the line so others can sleep safely. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe.